So what is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease? Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is a prion-induced infection with four main types. So we have iatrogenic, sporadic, familial, and variant. So sporadic is essentially when prions just form sporadically in the brain from normal healthy proteins. And iatrogenic is when the prions from an infected individual are transferred via surgery to another person due to maybe there's an organ transplant that's happening and an infected person has infected organs and they're transferred to another person. And then there's also familial, which is when there's a certain gene in our DNA that can code for the formation of prions, and that can infect our brains in that way. And then there's also variant CJD, which is essentially when humans eat infected meat, such as cows, infected with prions, which can happen due to mad cow disease. This can actually cause infection in humans. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease was discovered in the 1920s by German scientists Creutzfeldt and Jakob when they were trying to pinpoint the reason for mysterious illness in humans, and they noticed similarities between that and also bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE, in cows, which is also known as mad cow disease. Even despite the fact that they made this discovery, they didn't realize the cause of this disease until the 1970s. Fast forward to the 1970s, a scientist by the name of Stanley Prusiner, who is also professor of neurology at UCSF, was tasked with discovering the cause of an illness contracted by an individual. In 1972, he was funded by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Eventually, because he could not find this cause, he was cut off from his funding. But eventually, another foundation picked him up and gave him some more funding. And then he came to the realization that this disease was not caused by a bacterium nor a virus, but it was caused by some sort of new pathogen, to which he coined the term prion. And he was actually awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1997 for his contributions. And to date, many scientists are building more and more evidence on prions and how they infect individuals. And thanks to him, we have all this information that we have now. So you mentioned prions. What are prions exactly? Prion is essentially a misfolded protein at its most basic form. And prions, essentially, they latch together with normal healthy proteins, and there's a junction in the middle of the protein that's held together by hydrogen bonds, and a prion is able to break that junction and cause misfolding, and then the prion becomes misfolded. And at that point, the real issue with prions is that they can accumulate together, unlike normal proteins, and then they can drill holes in the brain, or they can accumulate throughout the lymphatic system, and they can latch on to different cells. So in this little drone shot here that I created, I wanted to display a metaphor for how prions attack our brain. That's essentially what their ultimate goal is, to accumulate in our brain tissue. So this is my neighborhood here, and you can see these roads, and those are like the neural pathways in our brain. And the houses are all the little complexities and nuances within the brain. And then we have this field here, which essentially represents what an accumulation of prions would look like. And you can see how it kind of pushes the neighborhood apart, similar to how prions push away brain tissue, which causes a loss in brain function. Prions also work to attack the immune system, and they do this by eating away at the dendritic spines, which are essentially, it's a part of the brain, and that's kind of how the brain communicates with itself and also with other cells throughout the body. And by prions eating away at this, it prohibits a communication, and it also causes the brain to not be able to send a proper immune response. Let's talk a little bit about how prions infect humans. So once they're in the body, they actually start gathering generally near the epithelial cells of the human, so that's in the gut. And then once they're gathering along the lining of the gut, these cells called M cells, via transcytosis, they capture these prions in little vesicles, and then they travel across the cell until they're expelled on the other side. And once they reach the other side, mononuclear phagocytes sample any pathogens that might cross over and then bring it to other lymphoid tissue. But this is exactly what these prions are kind of looking for, because then from there they can make a full-on infection and attack on the immune system via the dendritic folding that I mentioned earlier. You can think of prions as a sort of Trojan horse, because as they ride these mononuclear macrophages, they can circulate throughout the entire body where the immune system is completely unaware of their presence. And the main reason for this is because prions infect proteins within the body and they cause them to become misfolded. But the issue is the immune system cannot distinguish these normal healthy proteins and prions, which makes this disease all the more troubling. Okay, if this infection is so rare, then why should I be concerned about it? This infection process is manifested in the symptoms that result from CJD, which include slurred speech, changes in disposition, changes in memory and intelligence, anomalous jerking movements, and ongoing loss of brain function as these prions accumulate in the brain and start drilling holes. It's also important to consider the fact that chronic wasting disease, or CWD, is rising among animals like deer. And while it's not known whether CWD can transmit to humans, the fact that mad cow disease can spread to humans may shed light on the fact that CWD could ultimately spread to humans. And then at that point, we really need to figure out some sort of treatment in order to treat this, because this could cause some sort of epidemic. This disease may be fatal, but shouldn't we be spending more time working on medications or vaccines for other infections? Let's get into these medications a little bit more. So they're currently on the market. There are only medications to slow the spread of prions throughout the body. So you can reference medications like quinacrine, which essentially inhibits prion accumulation and kind of slows that process, but it doesn't actually really extend human lives. And there's also one called pentosan polysulfate, which is a heparin, meaning it prevents blood coagulation. And this once again kind of slows that prion spreading process, but eventually the prions are able to overcome all of this. So what scientists are really excited about, however, is the idea of prion vaccinations, where prion-specific monoclonal antibodies are injected in the body to block transmission, because our bodies can't create antibodies against these prions. And there's currently work being done on this in the United Kingdom. And there's also mucosal vaccines that are on the horizon that are being worked on to examine how they can protect against CJD, especially variant CJD. So by using phage display, we can discover the different monoclonal antibodies necessary in order to make this vaccine possible. In addition, there are still thousands of people who contract CJD every single year throughout the entire world. And because of the 100% fatality rate, it's still worth it for scientists to investigate different ways to treat and ultimately prevent prion-induced infections. And speaking of that, unfortunately, no preventative measures exist for preventing prion infection, besides making sure that you're not eating infected meat and being careful where you do that. But there is hope with these treatments on the horizon.